Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. Fabien Cousteau, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast.
Good morning. Happy to be with you.
I spotted that you're the lead author of this very interesting report, Making Buildings Suitable for Sustainable Mobility, comparing regulations for off-street bicycle and car parking in Europe. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but basically a report all about both bicycle and car parking for off-street buildings in Europe. The report is from the European Cyclist Federation, the ECF. You have a bunch of recommendations, and is there an elevator version of those recommendations? If someone says, tell me the recommendations in 30 seconds or less.
The touch base is introduce minimum bicycle parking norms and get rid of your minimum car parking norms and substitute them by maximum car parking norms. That's the baseline.
That's 5 seconds. Well done. Were there any findings that struck you as especially surprising, like your number one surprise that you tell people when they ask you?
We were really surprised by the bicycle parking regulation in Bulgaria. Bulgaria is usually not a place that we associate with being a bicycle paradise, but their national bicycle parking norm is really progressive. I mean, they have prescribed at the national level to very much detail how much bicycle parking they have to provide at very different destinations. And one innovative element I found is that they introduced a two-class system. So they have class 1, which prescribes numbers for long-term parking, and then the second class would be for short-term parking. And that parking can be on the surface. It doesn't have to be theft secured, etc., etc. So you would have a higher figure for short-term parking, for example, at cinemas, where you have a lot of traffic, basically. People come and go. So these different needs are being accommodated in this law, and I find that way surprising. So we felt if you can do this in a place such as Bulgaria, you really can do this everywhere, can't you?
And so that was a good practice. Were there any particularly surprising horror stories or bad practices?
Bad practices, I mean, if you look at car parking, we still find many places where minimum norms are prescribed at national or regional level. For example, if you look at Vienna, it has a minimum norm in place for car parking.
Right, that surprised me.
Vienna is, Vienna is usually associated with high quality of life. It has a very developed public transport system. Walking is very nicely developed in Vienna. Cycling is also on the rise, but still misses that element of discouraging car use, we think. And certainly its car parking policy in that sense is not very progressive. So it should look at some comparable German cities such as Berlin or Hamburg, which have renounced on their minimum car parking norm and have basically introduced a laissez-faire policy. So it's free for the developers to provide for car parking or not, depending on the demand, I guess.
Right. Yes. I interviewed someone from Berlin about the Berlin policies a few episodes ago, and that was fascinating. And by the way, I'm in Singapore. Singapore is like Vienna. Singapore is famous for its sustainable mobility policies. But again, like Vienna, this one blind spot is parking requirements still exist in Singapore as well. Fortunately, they're rather low. They're at low levels. That brings me to another horror story, which is Hungary. The car parking requirements in Hungary that I saw in the report are rather shocking. I think it was one space for every 20 square meters for offices and similar for shopping. And I think it was one per unit for apartments, which is not so unusual.
The one car parking space per apartment is really the standard. That's what we find very often. But you're right. The regulations for office building, one space per 20 square meters is a lot. That's something that should not be applied, honestly.
If we dig into the details, Hungary was in your yellow category, which meant that although there were these national standards which were not so great, there was some flexibility at local level. But the yellow meant the flexibility was not very much, or some sort of restricted flexibility, I gather.
It's restricted flexibility. So it usually says that developers can pay out, so they can basically pay a fine to the authority if they want to provide for less car parking than the law says. That's one way. Another way we often find is that you can go below the minimum requirement if you introduce some mobility management measures. So if you provide for car sharing, if you provide for bike sharing, these kind of services, then you are free to go below the minimum requirement that the law says. Right.
Yeah. So that was very. Anyway, yeah, it was very interesting.
It is, yeah. But it's the possibility to pay a fine to the authority if you provide for less car parking than is required in the law. Then that feels like a tax, than just set a lower minimum or get rid of the minimum in the first place.
In the United States, they call that a payment in lieu of parking, and it's a fairly common policy. It's better than having a rigid minimum.
It is, yeah.
But it still sends the signal that the city government wants more parking, which may be the wrong signal to be sending. Yeah.
No, absolutely agreed. Yeah.
It was interesting to me that it was the ECF, the European Cyclists Federation, that produced this report. Can you tell me a little bit more for listeners outside Europe? What is the ECF and why are you interested in parking?
Sure, happy to do that. So the ECF is the umbrella federation of the national regional cyclist user organizations here in Europe, and try to lobby on their behalf here in Brussels. We have been around since 1983. We have about 80 members in 40 countries. You may know that we organize the Velocity Series conference since 1980. And since 10 years or so, we are also going global with that conference. So we have been to Vancouver, to Adelaide, to Taipei, and Rio de Janeiro last year. So we try to create a community across the globe, really, and bring the good news of cycling that can deliver on so many policy areas. And we have been also instrumental in setting up the World Cycling Alliance, but we felt we also need that global voice on cycling.
Why is the ECF interested in parking at this moment?
Well, the European institutions have one policy in place. It's on the energy efficiency of buildings. So while this policy has been traditionally focusing on things that you generally associate with the energy efficiency, such as insulation, the Commission, when it issued a new proposal, also introduced elements for electric mobility. But these elements were mainly focused on e-cars, so specific infrastructure to charge, recharge e-cars. And we felt that electric bicycles were completely left out of the conversation. No, electric bicycles don't really need much of an infrastructure in terms of recharging. All you need basically is a household power plug, and then you can recharge your electric bicycle. But what we need really is the parking space.
So that was the trigger.
That was the trigger, basically. That was our entry point to get involved on this topic. So we started with bicycle parking, but then we thought we have to extend that also to car parking to make really a comparison how this is being regulated.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, but recently my other podcast, the Reinventing Transport podcast, was with Stefan Bakker from the Netherlands, and we talked mainly about e-bicycles. So that's quite striking. That's a hot topic as well at the moment in your sites.
Absolutely. It's if you look at the sales figures, they are growing by, I think more than 20% annually. We have had sales figures in excess of 2.5 million units last year in the EU. And we have absolutely great hopes in the e-bike that it will help to deliver that model shift that we advocate for. We know that people that have e-bikes cycle more often than they would do on conventional bicycles. They cycle longer distances. So it's a trigger to get people out of their cars and encourage them to use the bicycle more often on longer distances.
You know, the premise behind this report is that bicycle parking is important to people and important for sustainable mobility goals. Why? Is it just about the e-bikes, or is it more than that?
It is definitely not just the e-bikes. I mean, you mentioned the price tag that comes with an e-bike. Also, the e-bike is very heavy, so you have to easy access to bike parking. But on a general note, we know that if you want to convince people to use the bicycle on a daily basis, you have to make it to them as easy as possible to do that. And there's only a very tiny proportion of the population who is willing to take the bicycle up 2 floors and to park it into your apartment. The vast majority of people will not do it. You will only convince them to use the bicycle on a daily basis if there's really easy access to the bike parking. So that's why it is so crucial to get that right.
The key goals of the report had behind them this idea that car parking minimums, so promoting car parking with buildings, is generally a bad thing, but that promoting bicycle parking with minimum bicycle parking requirements is a good thing. So there's a sort of a contradiction there. Can you perhaps resolve that for the listeners?
Because our primary take was the energy efficiency of buildings, if you remember. So we found data from Austria, for example, that said that 50% of the energy consumption of a household living in a detached house comes from the car use. 50%. Whereas when you don't own a car, then this figure goes down by 38%. So households not owning a car consume 38% less energy than households owning a car.
One of the premises of this podcast is we are interested in making parking policy more consistent with sustainable transport policy. So I guess on the car parking side, the listeners will be reasonably familiar. So I guess the question would be, many of the Reinventing Parking listeners will be people who are opposed to minimum parking requirements for cars. And some of them may think, well, minimum parking requirements for anything then would be bad. Why is it that minimum parking requirements for bicycles should be good? Maybe they're bad too. How would you justify them?
Yeah, I mean, we want to discourage people to use their cars, but obviously you will only achieve that if you offer them a good alternative. The good alternative, we think, is the use of the bicycle. And you only get that if you make bicycle parking a requirement so that people can use the bicycle on a daily basis. It's, I think, as simple as that.
One of the objections to minimum parking requirements for cars has been the very high cost and the very large amount of space that is implied. You know, if you require too many parking spaces, sometimes a hefty proportion of the built space ends up being car parking and a hefty proportion of the cost. How costly are bicycle parking spaces?
So usually we would assume that you can park on one car parking spot about 10 bicycles. One underground car parking will cost you around 30,000 euros. It can be more expensive, can be a bit cheaper depending on where you live. So you could assume that the bicycle parking would cost you about 1/10 of that cost.
I saw an estimate along those lines in the report, yeah. When I saw that, I even wondered maybe it would be even better than that, because it probably didn't take account of the fact that the bicycle parking doesn't need so much space in terms of driveways and aisles and.
Exactly, you're completely right. Yeah, maybe the cost would be even lower than what I just said.
Yeah. So some of the key objections to car parking minimums don't apply with anything like as much force to bicycle parking because of they're so much more space efficient.
So you can also over-provide basically bicycle parking. You can provide too much bike parking. Figures have to be based on research into demand of bicycle parking, not to oversupply.
Okay, yes. And maybe together with a little bit of aspirational
exactly.
Vision.
Exactly. Where do you want to go? What's your objective in terms of model split for the next 10, 20 years? So aspire to that. Provide a little bit more than the current demand, but don't overdo it.
Let's dive into the report a little bit more. The report has a lot of detail, and we won't be able to summarize much of it in a little podcast, but I hope the listeners will be curious enough to go and download it. I'll put a link to that in the show notes of where they can go to get it. But the approach is a little different from what many of our listeners may be used to, because many of us have been focused on the local government level, the municipal level. But this report has a focus that's mainly at the national level, and at the next level down, maybe the subnational region, might be states or provinces or regions within nations. So that's an interesting focus. It surprised me a little. Could you talk a little bit about why that focus?
Well, one reason is very simple. It's a practical reason. I mentioned at the very beginning that there is a European legislation in the making. Because member states have to translate this into national law, our primary focus was the national situation in all these member states.
So that's interesting, because it gives different insights from what many of our listeners may be used to seeing.
Maybe just to add one thing.
Sure.
Obviously, the ramifications of mobility are wider than just the local situation. Huh? I mean, if we talk about climate change, air pollution, congestion, these are all challenges which go beyond the borders of a city. We have to address them at a regional level, at the national level, at the European level, at the global level. So we would strongly argue that car parking is also something for the higher level, and certainly some basic standards, some basic ideas have to be agreed at a higher level and cannot just left to the local level.
Yeah, it cuts both ways, doesn't it? So I was fascinated to see some interesting dilemmas, not so much highlighted, but I can see them here and there in the report as you explore the variations. And so Europe is a very complicated place with a lot of differences between the different countries and different regions. And that was fascinating to see the variety. Some listeners may have this vision of Europe as a sustainable transport paradise throughout. But it's very clear from this report that the variations are enormous.
The variations are enormous. I mean, we have cycling paradises as the Netherlands, and we have cycling hells like Malta, Romania. So we have really a wide set of mobility patterns here in Europe. It varies a lot from country to country, from region to region, and also from city to city. I mean, if you take, for example, Italy, you have mobility-wise very difficult places like Naples, and then you have fantastic cycling cities like Parma, student towns, which have cycling mode shares, I think in excess of 40-50%. I think that's also an argument to say, okay, we need to agree on a certain framework at the national level, but then the specifics, let's say the specific numbers, how much bicycle parking, how much car parking you have to provide, can be left also to the local authorities, depending on the situation on the ground in your town or city.
I see this debate elsewhere in the world. For example, California currently has a big argument about housing policy. And in recent years, they've also had arguments about parking policy, about the balance of power between the state government versus the local governments. And so increasingly reformers are focusing at the state government level and asking the state government to enact laws to restrain local governments from doing the worst things, while at the same time trying to leave room for some of the more progressive local governments to do better than the basics. And I can see that in your report where, so for example, you highlight France as doing well in both parking and in bicycle parking. And so it sort of, it sets a national sort of guideline or standard that is pretty good, but still allows local governments to do better than that. Is that correct?
Absolutely. The national standard is always just a minimum, and the local authority can always go beyond that national minimum standard. If you want to provide for more bicycle parking in an apartment block, for example, it's free to do so.
I can see that in the report you had a dilemma. You wanted to sort of categorize countries into excellent, good, sufficient, or insufficient. On the one hand, you want to praise countries that are forcing local governments to do better than they might otherwise. And at the same time, you also want to praise countries that are allowing local governments the flexibility to do even better than that. So you've tried to do that. It wasn't always perhaps elegant, but it's that I can see that was the intention.
It was certainly the intention. So, for example, the Netherlands, we know they do well regarding bicycle parking. Mm-hmm. But we only put them in the second best category because they don't give a national minimum to local authorities. What I do is they basically say at a national level you have to provide for bicycle parkings in all your developments without giving the specifics. But we know in the Netherlands, for example, the bicycle culture is so present. We know that cycling is included all planning processes. So this is well taken into account at the local level, and also in other places such as Denmark. This is absolutely the case there.
Okay, yeah. So I guess that might strike a reader or a listener as surprising that France came out as number one, and the usual heroes when it comes to bicycles didn't seem to be the heroes here. But that's the explanation, isn't it? That local discretion. Yeah,
it is absolutely. Yeah.
So just a reminder, I'm talking with Fabien Cousteau from the European Cyclists Federation about his report, Making Buildings Suitable for Sustainable Mobility, which focuses on off-street parking regulations in Europe for both cars and bicycles. Would it be true to say that the main focus of the report is parking with apartment buildings? Or there's a little bit of information about other buildings, but is it mainly about parking in apartments?
It is mainly about apartments. That's true. The whole classification and ranking that we introduced is based on how the policy is with regards to apartment buildings. We felt this should be the primary focus because many trips start or end in an apartment building. So we only gave some examples of regulations for other types of buildings, such as offices, industrial buildings, parking and public transport hubs for shopping. But our main classification is based on apartments.
Okay. Yeah. I appreciated those extra details, actually. And I think that the listeners to the Reinventing Parking podcast will be interested in some of those as well. So that's very handy. And hopefully it will make people curious enough to go and download your report.
Obviously, just having a good law is not good enough. The implementation is crucial. We have had many conversations with our people who provide us the data on where to basically put a country or region into what category, because they felt, okay, the law is good, but implementation sucks. So should there really be in the green category? Our argument was it should count what is in the law, and then obviously the implementation has to follow. You know?
Okay. So readers of your report should take some of these things with a little bit of grain of salt. It's official. That's the official policy, the official story, but reality on the ground is not always exactly like that.
The reality on the ground will be very different very often. I mean, Bulgaria, for example, the good practice examples I mentioned earlier on, introduced the law only about 2 years ago, I believe. So the implementation on the ground is just about to start. So it will take many years to roll out this policy, I believe.
Okay. Getting back to surprises, just briefly, there's another surprise. You managed to explain your recommendations in an extremely concise way just now, but one thing that constantly surprises me about parking is how complicated and complex it can be. Halfway through this process, did you feel you had taken on more than you realized, that this is such a complicated area and it's difficult to find all of these very detailed policies?
At times we had that feeling, absolutely. I mean, we looked at 56 different regulations, 28 national, 28 regional. It was a lot to take on. There's obviously also the language barrier. It's difficult to check a law in a language that you don't master. Regulations are also changing all the time, so we had to change our findings at certain times. And it was difficult to come up with a comprehensive classification that would do justice to all the different regulations that we found. That's why we came up with these 4 different clusters, both for car and bicycle parking.
I guess the message there is for those who read your report and may be tempted to quibble with the details and argue with where you put things, just chill a little bit. They did their best, and but what we should do is be grateful that you've embarked on this difficult thing, which is international comparisons on parking policies, which I've done my share of that in the past, and it's certainly not easy. So I certainly appreciate your effort on that.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, we didn't find anything comparable for the European Union, at least. So we really felt we entered a new territory, something that has not been done before. The systematic overview of so many different regulations. And certainly what we did not find was a classification on where to put it, the different regulations, basically.
As non-parking experts, you've done a very good job, in my opinion.
Thank you very much.
I guess one final question would be, you launched the report a few weeks back. How has the response been so far?
Very positive. I mean, we had, for example, the European Commission at our launch event. I said before, they are working now on the transposition of the European law into national law. And the European Commission, which is, let's say, the government of the European Union, will provide a guidance note to member states on how to transpose that European law into national law. And they were very positive about this report, so we hope they will introduce some of these results, the classification, into the guidance note they will provide to member states. And hopefully member states will feel inspired by the report and follow at least some of the recommendations.
I see.
We also had some people coming from regional levels, such as Lower Saxony in Germany. They want to revise their parking code regarding car parking. We know it always takes a year or two to revise a law, and then it will take many years to implement it. So it's a long process. There are no quick wins here in parking policies, but it's something that we have to work on, really, because it's one of the key ingredients on how to make our mobility and transport system more sustainable.
Fabien, thank you very much for being my guest today on Reinventing Parking. It's been a fascinating discussion and an unusual one for the listener. The usual parking policy topics that we tackle, we haven't included bicycle parking in the past, so this is a first for us. Thank you very much.
It was my pleasure to be your guest on your podcast. Hopefully it will inspire people to take on these recommendations.
I hope so too. Thank you. You've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.